I went to Berkeley as an undergrad, and while I was there, I got introduced to Schindler's work and just immediately connected with it.
Hmm.
In that he took these materials that other people saw as just industrial materials like plywood and stucco, and then put them together in a really poetic way, connected to the, the specifics of like a Southern California landscape. And that house, does that incredibly well. In that it's both inside and outside. It's both sort of material, but also integrated. Though the only thing I would say is I'm pretty tall, and I guess he worked for Frank Lloyd Wright, and I don't know how tall Schindler was, but I feel like a giant sometimes. So that's my only complaint is, the Frank Lloyd Wright height of things doesn't really work very well with my height.
It does seem like actually a lot of the older homes were just smaller, not just in footprint, but also like everything was tight. The heights of things.
People were shorter.
Do you think that's what it was?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it is true. I mean, it's just think about probably didn't have as many hormones in the meat products that we use today.
Good.
They were eating organic chicken back then.
Yeah, so they say normal human size.
Yeah.
I have to say, I've been to the Schindler house when I was in 4th year of architecture. I was from France, so I came studied in California and took a trip there. And I remember going there and with friends, and I was like, I don't understand this building. What is this? Is this a house? Is it like some sort of installation art structure within the landscape? Like maybe because there was no furniture, I could not tell what it was. It was kind of this mystery piece until I went back and eventually figured out it was a house.
Yeah, I think you say that because I think what's fascinating to me is the house is as close as LA comes to almost like this historical artifact, in a way, for its kind of 20th century evolution, because it's like when it was built, it was sort of in the middle of the desert. When you look at the early photos, it was just like this completely empty landscape. And then over time, it's slowly been surrounded by, the evolution of Los Angeles, right? And so it's an island now when it used to be kind of a refuge,
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
That's a good point, because actually, even though the house, still works and there's open space all around it, it's sandwiched between buildings and there's an asphalt street in front and everything. It's very different than what it was originally with that kind of landscape. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, but I think that's a testament to how good it is.
Yeah. It survived
because it kind of makes its own gravity, and then I'm sure originally it was oriented towards views and all of those types of things, but now it's not, it's its own, it still exists as its own kind of element. I think that's really, and I mean, Schindler, I remember reading all about Schindler and getting his drawings and being fascinated with his plywood furniture. I mean, he was so experimental and I think ahead of his time, and just going out there and doing these really interesting, innovative things that I think had a huge influence on the architecture of Los Angeles and SciArc and all the folks that kind of came after.
So listeners are probably wondering, where are you from originally? Where did you grow up? What was it like there? And, eventually, how did architecture come into your focus?
Well, I was born in Washington, D.C., so, kind of jokingly, I wasn't born in the United States, but in the district, as they call it. And I lived in outside of D.C. in Maryland until I was 10. And then when I was 10 years old, my dad was just like, got a job on the West Coast in this town called Santa Barbara. He was a doctor, and we decided to just move to the other side of the country. So I remember we had an orange Suburban and a green Prowler trailer, and we like drove across the United States.
Whoa.
In 1978, so, and then I arrived at this strange land called California, and people that spoke in really odd ways. Like, I remember going to elementary school the first day, and they're like, "Hey, dude, what's up?" And I'm like, "Dude, what's that word?" And it was like the Santa Barbara in the 70s. We were wearing like, velour shirts and OP corduroy shorts and, Vans.
OP, yeah.
And these brands I don't even know if OP exists anymore.
I don't think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I had this sort of whole experience then growing up kind of on the beach in Santa Barbara, going from like this sort of very, in a way, uptight East Coast or, Washington, D.C. kind of world, to a place like Santa Barbara where you were just outside all the time.
Uh-huh. And
it was kind of, in a way, idyllic, because it's, even though my parents got divorced, like everyone else's parents at that time.
Right.
But, I just was outside all the time. And because of that, this is pre-internet, pre-cell phones. So we just like kind of roamed.
That's cool.
And then from there, I ended up going to Berkeley.
So how did, there's definitely a culture shock going from DC to California. You were a little kid, but did California just seem like casual hippie town, like not very serious in a way?
It seemed just more like just different priorities, I think that what might have seemed as like I remember I was, people had different priorities about their lives and what was important. I think within, and I think my parents were a little surprised too. It's like, my teacher in fourth grade, I remember I was like very into my handwriting. She didn't really care.
That's a good teacher.
She just was like, what, it wasn't like I was like, well, then why should you not? So I went a little downhill there, and then I think that kind of pulled me out, put me in another school. But I would say like, like things that are not related to, your sort of classical metric of achievement, like just surfing or going to the beach or just being outside. They were as kind of important and valued as like, getting good grades. It's just that it doesn't mean that I wasn't interested or trying to do well in school, but you just sort of saw the fact that, people could be really happy not trying to fit into the sort of typical meritocracy,
right.
Focused on grades.
I think those differences between East and West Coast generally still exist. East Coast is definitely generally career driven in a certain sense that there's a ladder that you climb, and there is a ladder and there's advances you make in those steps, and that's how it works. And the West Coast, even the career driven folks on the West Coast tend to be less on the conservative side for sure, maybe, and more of the radical, innovative kind of mindset, certainly with Silicon Valley.
I think it's a really good point. And I think how that plays in design is like, I think the kind of the landscape gives you this sort of perspective or almost a backstop in that you're like, well, if it all goes to whatever, hell,
yeah,
I could just go to the beach and I'll be okay.
Yeah.
You're not like, it's just beautiful. You're just like, wow, I'm just so happy here.
Yeah.
I'm not doing anything. I haven't achieved anything, but I could just spend some time here and I'd be fine.
Yeah.
And I think that gives you maybe a sense like you won't lose everything because of that connection to the natural world or to the ocean or to mountains or those types of places, I guess is what I'd say.
So when did architecture become an interest? When you were a kid, did you understand what architecture was? Did you grow up drawing, making stuff out of cardboard or Legos?
Yeah, I think it became, there's a great photo of me like just building blocks with my dad and just all this like slobber going down my front. I'm like, 2 or 3 years old, just like obviously just happy as a clam, and I'm building blocks and towers, that are taller than me, as a little tiny kid. So, my dad, I think, spent a huge amount of time just building things with me, as a little kid. And I was clearly just an interest, I love to do that. And that kind of graduated into like building train sets, in the basement, and then arranging, little worlds, and then, then more train sets. And then I started to build, plastic models, like little military tanks and stuff like that. But I think what was funny is like, I wasn't just happy building the tank. I had to put it in a diorama. That was the thing, it couldn't just be so it was like, you had to have the
world,
the world. And then, I'd build this beautiful model, and then I'd start like putting bullet holes in the planes and
right.
patina. So it was like, and it was this whole, I had all these testers paints, and I paint all these things. So that was really, but I wasn't like focused on architecture really. Though I do think a huge, there were two huge influences for me early on, just from a kind of how you grew up. And one is, my mother's German. So, and she's like the only individual or family who ever left the town, that she grew up in. So she has this really sort of, strong network of people in Germany that, and she grew up in a winery in the Rhine-Pfalz region, which is near Alsace, near France. And so I would go there as a kid, and then, the house was built in like 1785 and everything was just ancient, right? A lot of it had been bombed, but you just had they had like Romanesque churches, and I would go there with my mom as a kid, and I'd never seen anything like that of that age. So that, and I think my mother's father, I think he wanted to be an architect, and he never spoke English. We just got along. He would love hanging out with me, and it was just we just had a connection. But he would spend a lot of time in this old house fixing it, reworking it. So it was like, you're not quite sure, is this old or is this, it all looked kind of old, right? But he obviously had reworked all these pieces to kind of integrate it into this old house. And always sort of was interested in this really beautiful cobblestones and beautiful old house with all the shutters. So I had that experience, which was very unusual. And then I came back to kind of suburban Santa Barbara.
Super different.
It's like, we lived in a ranch house that was built in like, 1975.
Yeah.
So that was a big piece. And then the other big influence for me was, and my great-grandfather was a scientist in Cape Cod, at a place called Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And there's the Marine Biological Laboratory there. And in 1928, he built a house there because he was always coming there for the summer from, I think it's from Vanderbilt in the South, where he was a professor. And he built the house, and I just found this out like maybe 10 years ago. He bought like 2 boxcars of Oregon pine. It's ponderosa pine. I'm sure it was really inexpensive. And, shipped all the way out from Oregon to like, to New England, to Woods Hole, right to the edge of the ocean. And then the entire house is built out of that wood, just planks, all exposed. There's no sheetrock. And, I remember going to that house. I've pretty much gone there every year for the last 50 plus years. And so as a little kid, I kind of, even when I was living in Washington, D.C., and we lived in a new subdivision in Maryland, you'd go to this house and it just had this material quality, where you could see the fingerprints of the two Irish carpenters who put the whole thing together. It's just beautifully made. So that house, kind of the material character of it, it's like coming down as a kid and it's kind of dusty and you see the sun. It just had this one material, but really beautiful.
I could see how that would leave a very strong impression on someone, especially if you, again, as you said, you grew up in a ranch-style house. Probably had 2x4s and gyp everywhere, and
and a lot of wall-to-wall carpet.
Yeah.
A white wall-to-wall carpet.
Oh, why? Really? Oh, wow. So it sounds like some of those memories are from when you were a lot younger. So how did you end up deciding to go to Berkeley for architecture, though? I mean, was there ever a thought where you would study some other creative field like industrial design or whatever else?
Yeah, I mean, the story is I was kind of scheduled to go to Turkey on an AFS exchange program because I was really interested in, studying abroad. And at that time, they had these terrible bombings in Turkey, and my parents were just like, we're not comfortable with letting you go. And so they said, my grandfather's like, oh, I went to the school back east. And I had no idea about prep schools or private schools at all. Been in public school in Santa Barbara. And he's like, it's this school he went to, when he was much younger. And they had a summer school there. And so I went and, because I couldn't do this other program. And I was 17. And they had like a bunch of classes, and I was like interested in archaeology because I'd seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, so I thought that was cool.
Yeah, that's a reasonable train of thought.
If you're, going to California, that was sort of like how you kind of figure things out. And then my mother was, European, and I was interested in diplomacy. So I was like, maybe there's a class, I'd take another language. So I took this class in Chinese, and I was always loved to write. That was what I loved to do. It's like creative writing. And I said, well, to the council, I said, yeah, I'd like to take a writing class. And they're like, sorry, that class is all full, but we have this architecture class. And I was like, architecture, maybe I'll do that. And, I did that. And it was just like, I was like staying up all night building models. It was just like completely like, okay, this is it, right? This is what I want to do. I mean, I was so obsessed that I still have pictures of this. I designed this house that was modeled after a spiral staircase, and each room was a.
Oh, that's cool.
I mean, but that's like the classic architecture thing. And then I was so obsessed with it that I couldn't bring the model home. So then when I got home, I rebuilt the model at home, so it was just like,
wow.
So I was like, and then that really, and so that happened, and it was really kind of fortunate because then I was like, okay, I want to do architecture in architecture school. So
was that, there was a summer program you mentioned?
Yeah.
Right. Was that summer program more, and you might have already explained it in a sense, but was it more of the abstract kind of early first year, almost artistic kind of studying and thinking, or was it more like a CAD drafting course?
It was more first year artistic. I mean, it was really fortunate in that, it was at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and they had like Louis Kahn's greatest work.
Okay, yeah.
So you're like, what? You're just like, and I had no idea who Louis Kahn was, and we had our professor who was just a young student, I think, young graduate of Princeton's architecture school, and I was a California kid. I had no clue. Like people, and he's like, this is like one of the greatest works of architecture. And I'm like, oh, really? Oh, wow. That's a lot of concrete. It's nice. It seems like, where's the door? I can't find the door. Because that building is like it's really like, why is there this little door in this big building?
You're talking about the Exeter Library?
The Exeter Library. So it was just like kind of I just got punched right into it, I mean, and I didn't even know what had hit me, and because it's a pretty spectacular building, and it was like the first modern piece of architecture I ever visited.
Wow.
Yeah, the bar was set very high for you after that. I'm a huge fan of. We're both huge fans of Khan's work. That's one building I want to see. I have not seen it yet. I'm sure it's stunning in real life. I
mean, the funniest story about that, and just to one aside, is that when I had Peter Zumthor as a studio professor at Harvard, he's like, I want to go see, these buildings. I want to go to Yale, and I want to go to Exeter. And the second time I came to that building was with Peter Zumthor, and he's like, this is the best building anywhere.
That's amazing.
And I was like, oh, okay. Last time I was here, I was like 17. I was like, where's the door?
You're like, I don't know. This is just a library for me. I don't know what you're talking about.
But yeah, it was great. I was really fortunate to kind of have that experience. Just coming back to the East Coast and really just not understanding anything. I was just like, oh, this is like my second choice. I didn't really want to be here, but I could get into it. They had some space, but it actually changed my whole trajectory, I think, of my life.
Yeah. What was it about the studio and the work that you found so captivating, so much that you would go back, to your place and continue to work on the projects?
You mean when I was at Exeter?
Yeah.
I don't know. I loved, I think it was the act of building the model was, I somehow, it just was super relaxing, like super, maybe a sort of form of meditation, where you just sort of like aren't using, your brain in a traditional way. I really just enjoyed, that kind of meditative construction, and then you end up with something that, where you've built every piece of it. And I think that that was, I think, what I really enjoyed, and I never really experienced that before. I think it was kind of maybe a return to, like, as a little kid building the blocks, and you just pick the block and put it there, and then you kind of have this thing that's additive. And it's a different, I think, way of thinking.
Interesting.
And when you're trying to sort of be analytical, or you're trying to actually write, where you, instead of you can physically take things, put them together, or attach them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Nice.
So you did that program and then decided to go to Berkeley. You were not interested in staying on the East Coast for architecture school?
Well, I was in California. I see what you're saying. At that time my parents were divorced, and my dad, awesome, he was great. He was dealing with his own things, and my mother who was European and never been to college and never been through the sort of applying to college kind of thing. So it was a little bit on my own, and it wasn't terrible, but I remember like looking at East Coast schools, and it's kind of embarrassing. I was like, wow, there's a lot of essays you have to write. It's a lot of work
to apply.
I mean, and I didn't really have anyone saying, you have to apply to these schools. I was like, okay, I think I should go to college, right? I should go to college. I should apply. And I think I need to study a little bit for the SAT. So I did those things, but it was kind of self-paced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I applied to the UCs, and I applied to Cal Poly, and I didn't get into Cal Poly, but I got into a bunch of the UCs, and I had a writing scholarship to one of them, but I was super excited to go to Berkeley. And I never visited any of the schools. I just showed up the first day.
That's cool.
And I didn't even, I even like picked the dorm I was in because it looked cool. It has architectural interest, but it was an all guys dorm called Bulls Hall. And I was like, why did I do that? I mean, everyone else was like, oh, my parents, I can't live in I can't be in a co-ed dorm, or, like they were required. And they're like, why are you here? And I'm like, at the building complex.
You got your priorities
studying
correct.
architecture.
Yeah.
But it was a terrible dorm. It was like falling apart. It did look good, but it wasn't the smart choice probably for social life.
But I mean, you highlight a general point, I think, that obviously the education system and what it takes to apply and all of the research and planning that goes into going to college is so different now than then. And it's getting, I think, worse and worse and more constrained. Like every year it feels like. And there's something kind of nice and maybe remarkable about the more casual approach. If you applied, you get in and you show up. You don't do... a credible amount of money being spent traveling to all these colleges and interviewing them and doing all this and that. It's a massive undertaking, and partially for good reason. I get it, but also it's just everything's so incredibly planned for teenagers.
Yeah, my daughter's doing that right now. She's 17, and I do think there's value in both, but there's also maybe like you said, this idea of always having a plan or kind of mapping out the next steps, as opposed to sometimes just like, oh, okay, here we are. And I think that's a little bit like even how thinking about even travel, so much of how people travel today, it's like, okay, I have the itinerary. I'm going to go from here to here, here to here. And as opposed to the sort of, and and my partner, Pamela, and, she's sometimes like, I don't want to I just want to be able to just go, and maybe there's like, maybe you won't find a place. You'll have to go somewhere else. And then that kind of leads to it. I mean, just like if I'd been able to go to Turkey, I probably maybe wouldn't be in architecture, but is that bad? It's just a different path.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you got to Berkeley, it was a 4-year program at Berkeley. Were there any surprises about the education? I don't mean that as a criticism or anything particular about Berkeley, but just architectural education, where when you got into it, you're like, I didn't expect it to be X, Y, or Z, so abstract, so technical, anything like that.
I guess there were no surprises because I had nothing to kind of compare it to.
Sure.
So it was all just new. One thing that was a little bit crazy, my first year is I also rode crew. I got recruited to do it because I guess the coach would he would walk around and see the new freshmen coming up, and if you were over 6 feet tall, he'd come talk to you, or 6'3" or whatever.
Yeah.
That's what he says. Like, oh, you are you? I'm like, sure, okay, I'll do it. So I rode crew, and also did architecture, and that was super intense. I really enjoyed both, but so combining those things. But I think what was quite wonderful about Berkeley is the first year you didn't even use a Mayline. It was all hand drawing, aesthetics. We had this East German professor named Ralph Weber, and he would come in. He's like, get out your cropping L's. He'd make us he'd make these 2 L's out of paper.
Yeah.
We'd draw something and he'd show us how to crop it. I mean,
That's awesome. Get out here.
I mean? Just think about that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I know how to crop things really well because of him. It's like one of the first things he's like, look at this image. You can crop it this way. And, I almost want to get some cropping L's for people, but that's what you have that in Photoshop now. But we had 2 physical pieces of white museum board. So, and he was like a professor of aesthetics was trained in like Dresden, So, we had him, and then we had this guy, Tony Dubofsky, who was like, he was the artist who, grew up in Poland, I think. And he like drew like these Chagall shaped amazing paintings, like he's from the, Jewish culture. And so you had Tony and Ralph. Those were the teachers for our intro to architecture.
That's cool.
It was called 11A, which wasn't even architecture. It was just like teaching people about culture and art and how to think aesthetically. And then we had 11B, which was just focused on physical models. I still remember like our terminal class. I think they still do this at Berkeley. It's like a coat, desk, and chair, which is at all led on, crystal, like drawing, like this big by that big, all just hand drawn of a coat, desk, and chair. And you had to like put each one kind of in some way that was composed and then draw it.
Wow.
And it took like, like 25 hours to draw this thing, whatever, a lot of time. And so those are kind of like, that was the kind of what was our final semester project. And then everyone in the whole class, and there's probably like 50, 60 of us, pinned up all our drawings in one big hall. And they would go to each one and critique them. That's cool. All publicly. But that was pretty tough.
Oh, really?
There was no hiding.
Yeah.
No hiding at all.
And so how did you do in the pinup?
I think I did pretty well. I wasn't like a natural, I think I got like an A- or something. I wasn't like there was this woman, Emily, who could just draw like God's gift, and you just look at her drawings, and you're just like, oh, that's something. It's like
that's annoying, right?
You're just like, what? You can't do anything, So I worked really hard, but I'm good at drawing, but I'm not like a natural.
Right. It is interesting because I think for non-architects, they might be wondering, well, why would an architect, which sometimes has the reputation of being a very technical, almost engineering kind of profession, like why would you need to learn how to draw a coat, a desk, and a hanger, or whatever you mentioned, and learn how to crop things? That seems very outside of the realm of what an architect does,
And and I would say it's exactly what really good architects do.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
It's like, it's the difference between being, somebody who is just in a way recording and drafting and I shouldn't say really good, because it's like kind of, I think it's something that can be taught, I just think it's more like if you're really, architecture, the value of architecture is hard to quantify, right? But you can see it, or you can feel it when it's right, and you can also feel it when it's not so great, right? Or it doesn't really resonate. So I think that, and the difference might just be in the crop. It might just be in just a proportional thing that is in a way very much related to that kind of training.
Yeah. That's an interesting point, because we were reviewing some architectural images with some clients who are not architects, obviously, and kind of gauging their responses to it. And I think your description of the value of architecture or high quality architecture versus not in a visual sense is spot on, you know it when you see it and you feel it. And when it's not quite right, you know something's not quite right, but it might be really difficult to articulate it. Even if you're a fellow architect, you might be like, yeah, something's not right with this thing. I'm not sure. And it could be exactly just one tiny thing that's slightly off that's making you feel uncertain.
Yeah, I very much agree. And that's really, even when we're in the office, we kind of know, I don't know why, but it's just not quite there. And you can't really, and you don't even know how to fix it. Sometimes the fix, I think the most important thing is to sort of know that it's not quite there, and that you kind of have to keep open to maybe something coming in and bringing it to the level that you'd like it to be at. And you don't always get there with every project. And then sometimes it'll come just out of left field in some other process, or, sometimes the budget gets cut and you're like, oh, great, I can actually take another look at this, or I have to change it. So I think that the openness to knowing that it could always potentially be a bit better, and knowing what things can be a bit better in each phase, is, I think it's a big part of architecture. It's a big part of like doing better work is being open to those kinds of changes.
Yeah,
late
for sure.
in the process.
Yeah, right. After Berkeley, did you work for a period of time before going to grad school?
Yeah, I did. I graduated in 1991 from undergrad, and so that dates me a little bit. But it was like one of the worst recessions ever for architects, and I think people were, they're like, I think you're the only person in our class who got a job in architecture. I mean, or one of the few, because it was just at that point, and I'm. So many architects went off into like other professions. A lot of folks that I went to school with, ended up in digital fabrication or, tech and things like that. But architecture was really struggling at that point. And I remember I got done with school and there was no work, I talked to people and there was nothing happening in the San Francisco area or Berkeley. So I moved back to Santa Barbara and I ended up at this like residential architect that a friend of a friend knew, building like Spanish style colonial villas.
Okay.
And I was pretty depressed. I was like, here I am living at home, working on like Spanish style, like, whatever, McMansions, up in the hills of Santa Barbara. They were mansions. They weren't McMansions. They were like, and I was like, oh, what am I doing? And I just got a call out of the blue from my TA, Mitchell, who worked at this firm called EHDD, which is Esherick, Homsey, Dodge & Davis. And he's like, yeah, I remember you built really nice models. And we need a model built for the Doe Library edition at Berkeley. And I was like, okay, I'll be there tomorrow. So I drove up to San Francisco, and I think I slept on my sister's boyfriend's couch, for a while, and just started to work at this firm building this model. And I finally found a room in the city, and I worked there for about 6 years. But and got my license, and that time, I remember the first like all hands meeting at Esherick's office. They're like, we're not doing so well, and I just want to let you know I'm really sorry. We're gonna have to let 10 to 15 people go. I was like, oh. But I was like the young model builder. I'm sure I was super cheap. So they needed the model. So but I saw I saw this thing happen early on, and but I had a great experience there. I got to know Joe Esherick, who was this really amazing early Bay Area modernist. architect who worked on Sea Ranch. And, I still have good friends from working there. And, a lot of the people some of the people I worked with when I was there, now they run that firm.
Nice. That's amazing. It's pretty hard times, though. It's really difficult to be in an office and see, I don't know how large the office was, but 10 to 15 people and whatever size office disappears, pretty brutal to witness.
Yeah, it's hard.
Especially when you're young, starting your career. It's like, welcome to the working, professional world.
Yeah, no, it was like, okay, it was hard.
So there for 6 years, you get licensed. I mean, 6 years is quite a good chunk of time to be practicing. And so you decided to go to grad school. You mentioned you had Zumthor as a professor. I'm very curious, what was he like to have as a teacher?
It was pretty amazing experience. I remember, we remember the first day that, we showed up and we were in the studio in the trays at Gooden Hall, and it's like we were talking, and I think I said, "Oh, Peter, what would you like to do?" And he's like, "Eta." And I realized I'd made like a huge faux pas, because my mother's German, and I was used to calling, the other teachers by their first names, in the previous year. And I'm like, oh, he thinks he should be called Herr Zumthor or Professor Zumthor. And he's like, he kind of looks like, Eta. Okay, Eta. You can tell it was just kind of going in his head. It's like, oh, that's how they do things at Harvard. You don't call your teacher Professor
Petey
Smith, or but I think so. It was just that was the start. I think it was the first thing I said to him. But I think what was amazing about working with Peter was he was just sort of at this point where he came to Harvard, and he just sort of, I think, shut his office down and just would spend a week, almost like a vacation, with us. and unlike other professors, he just wanted to spend time with students. So he would we'd have our class, and then he's like, oh, if you want to get drinks or go get dinner, we'd go get dinner. And then we'd go out to some place, a bar, hang out, and then he would go home, around midnight, and then we were all kind of revved up, and we'd spend 4 or 5 hours just talking about architecture and everything we talked about. And then since I was from California, I grew up playing tennis. At that time, Peter was learning how to play tennis, and he's like, "Oh, you play tennis?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah, I'm working on getting better at tennis. It's this new thing." And he's like, "So let's go play tennis." I'm like, "Okay." So I would stay up till 5 a.m, and then at 9 a.m, or whenever, I'd pick up Peter and we'd go play tennis. And then, and he was okay, and I was sort of rusty, but I mean, I played in my high school in California. So I played pretty competitively, and then, we go to the business school, go play tennis, and then he's like, "Oh, let's go get a cappuccino." So I'd sit there and Peter.
That's amazing.
Peter Zumthor, and I'd ask him questions "Oh, so how'd you get interested in architecture?" I was like, "Well, I don't know." I was like, it's a funny. So because of that, and the other thing with Peter is he really didn't like Gund Hall. He didn't like the open trays. He's like, I can't work in this space. And so originally we got he's like, I need a room where I can come back to and I can leave stuff and teach. And so we ended up, I think this is the only time it's ever happened at Harvard, is he ended up renting a little warehouse in the town right next to Cambridge. What's it called? I'll remember in a second, but and where we would have the studio.
So everyone else,
and he spent his stipend. He's probably spent like $30,000-$40,000 of money to rent this thing for a couple, whatever, 3 months or something. And so we like renovated it and painted it, and like made this sort of thing where we do our installation for our studio, and at the end we had this big party, and invited all these people, invited the whole school to come to the review, and it was a craziness, right?
So the entire school's in Gundhall except for you guys. I imagine the studio wasn't very big. I mean, it's like what, 10?
No, it was like
people?
12 people.
Yeah,
we had this like warehouse, that we were in, and Peter. We would come with Peter, and he would kind of, it was. I remember the program was a house with 7 rooms, but he didn't want us to draw the house. He wanted us to kind of present the experience of each room in the house and do it in full scale, or like with images or projections or furniture or installations. But we never did like detailed drawings. They were like charcoal sketches of diagrams of the spaces and objects that would be in them.
Cool.
So it was like I think that, the leadership at the school thought, Peter's going to come and he's going to be so hard on these students. He's going to show them how to detail all this stuff. And he came in and he's like, yeah, it's like, if it was for me, I would be like, right on. But because it wasn't his work, he was just saying, this is how I think experiential about my work.
Mm-hmm.
Like in a very, he was a huge fan of like American poetry, like William Carlos Williams, or like just this sort of descriptive, phenomenological, experiential, material, concrete way of thinking about design.
Mm-hmm.
Like he saw like materials like words of a poem, and you'd put them together, and that would kind of create an atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So he was always sort of like, wow. It's like, just imagine a space, he would say, loose gravel, with spruce, with a yellow colored window. He's like looking out at a lake. So how does that make you feel? Is that the right atmosphere, for what you're thinking? So it was very much that, like constructing these different atmospheres using materials almost as this sort of kind of grammar, almost like a haiku of architecture.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of, and after the studio, when I ended up at Herzog Dammron in Switzerland, I wanted to work for Peter, but it's kind of good that I think I didn't work for him, because he's always sort of up there. But I would go with my wife, and I would go to Cour. It's like, I think 2 or 3 times. And of course we'd go play tennis, and then we'd have dinner. But it was all about the tennis, I think.
Whatever. I mean, that's quite an education. I would imagine hanging out with Peter Zumthor in that informal matter, and then that studio you described, which sounds amazing. That's pretty priceless.
Yeah, I was really super fortunate, just lucky that worked out that way.
I think his studio now is like just a handful of people. He's very, very remote, for sure. So you finished, and you just mentioned you worked for Herzog and Dammron. How long were you there for? And then when did you end up starting your own practice?
I was there from 2000 to 2003, so there for 3 years. Oh. And our son, Zachary, was born in Basel. And I worked almost the whole time on the de Young Museum in San Francisco. And I was a senior architect on that. I was in charge of the facade, the envelope enclosure, and then the tower structure. So those are the 2 kind of things that I was, and then also the Pacific Exhibition Hall. I worked on a lot of that, but it was an amazing, unbelievable experience. And we developed this new technology for taking images and embossing and perforating them into metal. And this is funny, but if you go onto Zahner's website, that technology that we developed between 2000 and 2003 is, you can buy it now, right? You see parking garages with images embossed on it,
right?
Perforated. But we sort of invented that with them, and so I was going, there was amazing people there. I don't say, the team, there's this individual who's now, I think, an associate principal or partner, Dieter. He was my intern when I started there. And Dieter and I just got so deep into pixelation and embossing, how to figure out how to do this stained facade that we did for that project. So that was sort of my life for the 3 years I was there. And and then, I think completed that project. I was really keen on going back to taking the project all the way through. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they wanted me to do that.
Why?
So it was a little bit like I think they wanted to keep me in Switzerland. I don't, maybe they didn't want the knowledge, transferred. So,
mm-hmm.
It's not like I know the answer to any of these things or but, I think I just got to be in my bonnet to thinking about practicing in a place where, I would be more connected to the community. I mean, working at Herzog-Daimler in Basel at that time was such an amazing opportunity. I think there was we were the first 2+ Americans that had been hired there. When I started there, it was 73 people, I think.
Wow.
So, it was a really amazing opportunity. And I think, I sometimes feel like, we had visas to stay there permanently. They really wanted us to stay there. I think I upset them quite a bit when I said that I wanted to, when I decided that I needed to go or leave. And, it's the classic thing. You just don't know necessarily. You're young. You just don't know where you're at mm-hmm. necessarily. You don't understand the place and time. But, the flip side is if I hadn't left, I might still be there,
Sure.
Because it's, there's always that, there's no wrong answer. It's just the path you end up on.
So when you had made the decision or you realized that we're going to leave, was that also tied into starting your own office? Was that the same kind of decision, or were they separate things?
I'd say maybe in the back of my mind, but I think the first step I thought was hey, I kind of would like to be back on the West Coast, mm-hmm. And maybe be a little closer to family. We just had our first kid. And so I had this sort of idea of moving closer to Santa Barbara, to LA. So that was sort of the fantasy.
Yep. Sure.
And, the reality is, was what you kind of don't know what you have until you don't have it. Right. So there was definitely, like I said, there was a culture shock coming from the East Coast to California. There's also a culture shock coming from Herzog-Daimler and the level of architecture and exploration that we're doing there, literally inventing new building systems. Mm. And then coming back to the West Coast and you're pick out the cheapest metal panel that you can afford and go with that. It was just whoa, okay. Didn't really realize what I was doing, in Switzerland.
Did you ever regret leaving Switzerland?
When I first got back, I was like, that was the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. When I was first here, I was like, what did I do? So at the moment I was just like, this is what have I done? Crazy. But it also kind of prompted me to like think, okay, I need to change, and that kind of led to me coming to Portland and working for Allied Works. So it was sort of like I wasn't happy where I was at, and it wasn't like anything was wrong with it. It was just that the jump was too big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you decide to move to Portland? Did you know about Allied Works work prior to that?
I was in back in California, and my wife Pamela and I were like, well, whoever first gets a job, that's where we're going to go.
Bet.
So she was looking. We lived in the Bay Area and had a lot of friends there, and we still have a long, strong connection to the Bay Area. She was interviewing at jobs there. I interviewed at like SOM, and I interviewed at like a couple other small firms, and nobody was really hiring at that time. It was like 2003. I think there was like hiring freezes and stuff like that happening. And I just remembered, sort of in the back of my head, I remembered this project that Allied Works had done. It's called the Mary Hill Project. It's like an installation out in the gorge in Oregon. I'm like, wow, maybe I'll just send them a letter, and sent them, because I was just looking, we're like, well, the Bay Area is not hiring, so let's look at Seattle or Portland. And I remember that project, and so I just sent a letter, and they're like, immediately got a call back. And they said, oh, we'll fly you up to Portland. And they were just starting on the University of Michigan Museum of Art, and they needed somebody. So that's how I got going. That's how I got started there.
Wow.
So at what point did you decide to start Lever? Or when did you start the office?
It was 2009. So another
great time to be a practicing architect. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I've been at Allied 6 years. And at that time I was running Pixar Animation's sort of phase 2 headquarters in Emeryville. And it was sort of winding down, I could see. And we, it was a downturn. So the same thing at Allied, laid off like 10 people, and I was, a co-principal. So was involved in actually letting people go. And I could sort of see that eventually my number was going to come.
So you let yourself go.
No, and I was, wasn't a massive surprise when, you just knew that was going to happen. And so, Lever started, I started just on my own, and because of that, some folks just who I'd worked with closely are like, hey, we'd like you to continue on this project. But I continued in a different capacity. Sure. So it was sort of surprising, you're like, well, you build up relationships over a long period of time, and then you're in a different situation, and people are like, oh, hey, I see where you're at. Well, give me a call. Love to talk to you about something. So that's sort of how Lever got started. It was purely based on, just long-term relationships. And we also, I was really fortunate that a friend of mine, sort of an acquaintance who had been at school with me at the GST, but in the real estate program, had also ended up in Portland, and he was starting his own firm kind of at the same time as a development firm as Lever was getting started. And it wasn't called Lever then. It was just like T. Fitz Robinson Architecture. I didn't have a name. I was like, what am I going to call this firm? And so, Tom Cody, it's confusing because there's two Toms. He was starting his development firm, and that he had rented space at Allied Works office because they had extra space. And then we ended up then sharing space in another architect's office that we subletted and sort of started to work together. So that early sort of developer-driven work that was really kind of critical to the practice.
And what kind of projects were you guys doing in the early days?
We did the project called Union Way, which is this sort of Parisian-style passage from the Ace Hotel to Pals Books. And cool. Tom bought like two pieces. He was able to get they have these 50 by 100 foot lots, and he was able to get two back to back that span between the streets. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of created this passageway through the block. And then nearby, we also did this project called Art House, which was for the Pacific Northwest College of Art. But it was on property that was owned by the Powell family that owned Powell's Books. So that was our first ground up project in Portland, which is a huge opportunity. Mm-hmm. So, we were really fortunate, that the Powells were open to having us work on it. But we, at that time we also partnered. That was a big deal. So we were subleasing space in a firm, LRS, that been around for a really long time, done lots of multifamily. So we were kind of like the design architect working with LRS, who actually then was the stamping architect. Yeah. So it was actually great.
That's great. Yeah.
Lucky kind of coincidence. So since it was, we were in their office, the developer, the design architect, and the architect of record, subleasing cubicles from them because they had space.
That's amazing. That's an interesting situation. So
yeah.
The developer's the client, and they're rent leasing from the architect, who is also partnered with the other architect. That's pretty cool, though.
Yeah, I think that's Portland in a nutshell, a little bit. Okay. And the funny thing is, we've done 3 projects with them, all really great projects. Like where we're the design architect and they're the architect of record. And I think it was good for all of us. I think I'm still good friends with the project manager, Callista, who ran those projects. And I think her team actually enjoyed, in some ways, we look back on those days as kind of like, a little bit of a honeymoon kind of phase where it's like we focused on the design and the skin and the facade, and then just collaborated with them on the rest of the project. And I think, it worked out well for everyone, I think.
Kind of a honeymoon phase, because now things are just much more complicated in terms of the type of projects you take on, or?
Well, I think now we're more of a real full service firm,
I see.
And so, we're doing soup to nuts. We're still, and then we're still also then really understanding how valuable it is to collaborate too with other, expert firms. So, there was a time like, we want to do everything. And now we're like, there's some value in that level of collaboration. Like, we're just finishing up, we have no fear of doing the whole thing. It's just, we haven't been around 40 years, doing it many, many times. So, we learn, and get better. But we also, I think, by virtue of not having been around, we also are able to discover things that or do things maybe in a different way. That if you've always been sort of, this is the way I do it,
right,
might not kind of discover that.
Yeah. And so the other thing too is that your office has known for the use of mass timber as a building material, which has certainly become, I guess you could say, much more popular in the last 10 years, 5 years. So you'd have a better understanding of it than me. And there's an innovative kind of spirit to the office. I mean, it says on your website, but that also seems to be a theme of a lot of the experiences and things you've done in the past also. Seems to maybe stem from that.
Yeah, I think when you look at design, fundamentally, it's sort of a exercise in innovation, right? I mean, and creating value. And I think sometimes that isn't as top of mind with how people think about architecture today. And the reason I bring that up is Maillard, in Switzerland, he did these incredibly beautiful bridges, but they were also the cheapest. That's why he won the competition. They probably wouldn't be as cheap to build today, but so to me, that kind of connection is super important to kind of think about. And when you think about Robert Maillard and these beautiful concrete bridges, he designed them in a way where he didn't have to create a false work all the way down into the valley floor. So they were orders of magnitude less expensive to build, and they're also really beautiful. And to me, the innovation was, this is researching concrete structures and testing them and shaping them in a way where we created a lot of value that also happened to be also kind of beautiful, or more than kind of beautiful, really beautiful if you've seen them in person. And I think that, so that's where I sort of see, or sort of the kind of pinnacle of innovation, that you can create things that are both pushing, the envelope, but also creating value at the same time. And I think there's value that's more, quote, maybe more aesthetic. That's maybe the facade of the Dion, right? It creates a sort of sense of value as a sort of signature piece that's specific to that site, has a kind of resonance. And then there's value that's in the structure of the building. And I never thought I would do something as complex and as what we did with the Dion facade, but developing these new mass timber structures and testing them full scale on framework, and even some of the stuff we're doing recently. It's like you're working with the bones of the building, right? Which is not something architects get to do very often. I mean, Maillard and some of the early innovators in concrete, they were developing new systems. At the same time, you temper that in that, large timber systems is something that we've been doing, at least in Portland. They use these huge trees they should have never cut down to build buildings. I think we're doing it in a way that is more connected to a more sustainable framework, that, how we source, and then how that's connected to building, how forests are managed. It's all sort of integral, everything is connected, even if you don't want to. And I think we all know that. Now it's acknowledging that and then acting as if you understand that.
There's a lot of very interesting things you mentioned. You had that anecdote of when you're working at Horizon de Miron, and then you moved to California, and then you were speccing the cheapest metal panel that was kind of pre-made and whatnot. And that kind of producing architecture that way, which there's sort of a time and a place for it, is like very, very different from what you guys do and what you did with the young, but also what you do now with the mass timber. And the perspective you have, as you've described, is so much more holistic. There's the aesthetic, there's the structural, and then it goes beyond that to the sustainable. I guess one question would be, and this would be for people who are not experts in mass timber, is how is that as a material more sustainable than steel or something else? Because I hear quite often from, let's say, clients who are like, well, that's stupid. Why are you cutting down trees to build buildings? That seems the opposite of sustainable.
Yeah, I think the thing is to understand is that that working with timber, it's a renewable resource that doesn't require, if it's done in a sort of sustainable, managed way with forests, doesn't require huge amounts of energy and resources to actually produce. It grows with the power of the sun, right? It's like a agricultural product to a degree. And I think the thing that people, and this is something I've had to learn as well, is that almost all the forests you see today are not, quote, a native forest. They've all been cut, and they've just grown back. And they've grown back because we planted them a certain way, right? So they're not necessarily, they might have grown to a certain size. But sometimes these forests, because we planted them, they aren't necessarily always healthy. And that's what you're seeing with these catastrophic wildfires is, we've suppressed fires to the point where some of these forests are actually not healthy, they're not good places. And we need to think about more active management of these resources and thinking more long-term. Because, where I live in Portland, I have my house is from 1899 or 1891, and I have pictures from like the 20s, and there was like no trees anywhere along the entire hill. And now I can look out I have like 100-foot trees, all around us. So it's like thinking in those sort of time horizons of like, how do you manage forests? How do you think about this as a renewable resource? And so that's where we've been actually focused now, is like thinking about how we try to source the material. And it's not like we could do it on every project, but it's something that's very a very big effort to just connect, the material that you're building with to a particular to what I call sort of the material landscape, like to a particular place, to a particular site that's beyond the site that you're building in, and how the decisions you make relative to the site you're building on have a larger impact in the world as a whole. And that extends to issues around climate, it extends to issues around rural-urban economic equity. So those are all things that are kind of in the background. We can't tackle them all with a single project, but I think having more discussion about that is important. It doesn't mean that we don't build out of concrete or out of steel, and if many of the kind of current projects we're working on are actually hybrids, like most buildings. They're hybrids. There's wood, there's steel, there's concrete. It's just the degree of hybridization. I think what's exciting to us is that timber now has a real seat at the table, where you could, you used to have a building that was a steel building with concrete metal pan decks. Now you can have a steel building with a quote wood pan deck, right? And so I think we're not saying, we know that it's going to take time for people to feel comfortable with sourcing, with materiality. But I kind of, there's two analogies that I look at is, what's the most successful car in the United States after the Model T? It's the Prius, which is this hybrid, It's a hybrid, right? I mean, but without the Prius, you wouldn't have fully electric cars, right? Probably not. But the Prius, it's like it's got this little engine that takes you where you want to go, and then the electric, and we bring them together, and it's this sort of incredible thing. And I think that's, and then also I would say people looked at architecture more from a culinary perspective, like the revolution you've seen with food in the United States in the last, since I was a kid. People actually really do have more interest in like where their food's coming from, how it's actually grown, or those are all, and the impact that particular what they buy has beyond the fact that they're consuming it, right. So all those things I think can be brought into how architects think about design.
I guess a big part of it for you would be working with material suppliers who source things sustainably and have this ethos in the back of their minds, right? Or in the front of their minds, rather.
No, we've been really fortunate. We did this project for the Nature Conservancy, and we worked with this organization called Sustainable Northwest, which is really focused on creating markets from materials that connect to sort of Oregon's, I guess, the health of Oregon's landscapes. So, for example, on that project, they've been working with folks in Eastern Oregon to find a market for juniper trees. So juniper is a native tree to Oregon, but through kind of fire suppression over decades has proliferated to the point where it's actually drawing too much groundwater out of this parched landscape in Eastern Oregon, to the point where wildlife can't survive because there's no springs, because the juniper is just sucking up all this water. So they really want to find ways to cut down these trees, right? But it's like but to do it really effectively, they need to create a market for the product. So there's some value in doing that beyond just trying to sort of save the landscape and the corresponding like wildlife that used to exist in it. So we worked with them to just create this facade for this building using juniper. But just that chunk of the juniper we needed to do that facade, restores around 700,000 gallons a year of water back into that landscape. It's a small amount, but if you can create balance again, the balance used to be created by wildfires. There were lightning strikes and they would burn these trees kind of episodically. But because we suppress the fires now, there's too many. So that's just one example.
What are some of the limitations of mass timber or CLTs in terms? I know you guys built a pretty tall structure with it, but is there a height limitation with it, or are there limitations?
I mean, I think it's. I don't really think super tall buildings out of timber makes sense.
Because of structural reasons, or just?
I know people like that's, and I know that's probably controversial, but at least not necessarily. I think hybrids make sense, but different materials have different, and like I'd say like 15 to 20 stories in timber. That seems that's still pushing it right now, but I think it's like, what is really a timber high rise, right? Is it because if you have a concrete core and you can have wood floor plates, is that
the main?
Yeah. That's what most of these both timber high rises are. Sure. It's just wood is an amazing material. It has a very high strength to weight ratio, but it's also for a high rise is fundamentally a cantilever beam. And it's just going vertically. If you think of the world in a as a circle, it's like that.
Right.
It's just, and so it has to withstand that kind of force, right? And that's challenging to do in timber, more challenging to do in timber. But we're really keen on some of the sort of aspects of timber, of things that timber can do that other materials don't do as well. And so one of the things we've been working on is, and we've been working on this for quite a long time, is these resilient post-tension rocking wall lateral systems. So in a place like, I moved to California in 1978, and I can still remember like it's yesterday. I'm like, why is the ball bouncing by itself? It was like this big earthquake in Santa Barbara in 1978.
Why is it bouncing by itself?
We're like, whoa, we were 10. My sister and I were like, and my little brother, we're just like, oh my God, the balls are bouncing by themselves. What's going on?
Cool.
So, we're really interested in like this idea of these low-rise resilient rocking wall systems that could be prefabricated. And what that means is that, you would have the ability to reoccupy a building immediately after an earthquake. That's basically a spring-loaded shear wall.
I see.
So that kind of thing. And we're working on a project right now for our own office to test that out at a small scale. But there's a 10-story full-scale test on the Shake Table in San Diego that's happening at the moment. It's actually going to be happening very shortly. And it's all built. You can sort of see some of the pictures on our website. But and so we've been working on these sort of systems since 2016. When we were working on this framework project. So it's just that,
cool.
To me, those are kinds of things that are really interesting. I think the thing about timber, it's also this idea of sequestering carbon, in that we have an issue where, with these forests that are, say, burning or decaying, that's releasing carbon into the atmosphere. So when you take that timber that was grown by the sun and you put it in a building, you're sort of keeping that carbon in that building for the life of that structure. So that's what we mean by sequestering it, right? You're kind of banking it as opposed to it burning up in a forest fire, decaying. And then you're planting a new set of trees, right? That is actually cleaning the air, absorbing carbon. And then with the idea that at the right time, you could then bring that into a building.
So, some of the advantages of timber construction you've certainly talked about, and the innovations that you guys are doing. I think one question is, why, with all the stuff you said, why is timber not used more often? Is it because people have misconceptions about its downsides? Is it because it's expensive? But people, I hear all the time, oh, it's made out of wood. How does that deal with fires? Like, what is it that's not allowing mass timber to be used more?
Well, I think the thing is that is sort of the elephant in the room. Almost all of us live in timber houses. Most of the buildings in the United States are made out of timber. It's like, everyone's like, oh, I'm really worried about timber. Well, you probably grew up in a timber framed house.
Right.
And everyone did, and it's the minority of folks, like my wife, who grew up in Manhattan, who grew up in a concrete building, right? So we already use timber. It's just like we don't like to acknowledge the fact that stick frame construction is the sort of the heart of architecture or building in the United States and North America. And it's actually quite unusual compared to other parts of the world. And it's because we have these huge forests and this huge sort of supply chain that's set up around this prefabricated 2x system that's been around since 1840 or the middle of the 19th century. And our whole system of building is sort of set up around it in terms of resources, in terms of fabrication, in terms of even labor. But then everyone's like, oh, wait a second, you're going to build larger timber buildings. Like, oh, that's crazy. So I think the thing that's interesting on that regard is like stick frame has some problems in that it's, one of the reasons we spend so much time, if you're doing stick frame construction, on the assembly is you want to ensure that no fire gets into that frame, right?
Right.
You're having, and because you think about like any kind of fire, right? If you want to start the fire, you have little sticks,
Sure.
and you're trying to then light the big sticks.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is I think the other thing to think about, because fire is obviously the thing that comes up when people think about timber. But when you think of like, if you have a wood burning fireplace, if you have a big piece of a log, a lot of times that log, if you leave it alone, it just stops burning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really sort of the natural fire resistance of large pieces of timber, is that they char, and that char layer self-extinguishes at a certain point if there isn't something that's feeding it further. And that's also the resilience of timber structures, of larger timber structures, is that charring nature of timber. So there's that, there's, like you said, why? There's this sort of a little bit of denial about the fact that most of us live in wood buildings. We don't see the wood, so we don't think about it. And then two, just, the fear factor related to the fact that, we've had some huge fires in cities over the years, that have been related to the fact that we built timber framing and we didn't have as much care taken into separating, separations and things of that nature. I think, today we also have like sprinkler systems and fire alarms and, much more sophisticated ways of kind of tracking these types of things. And then third is just like, it's like, kind of Groundhog Day. It's like, oh, whoa, big timber structures. We haven't done that in a while, right? So we're like building a whole new supply chain and building up the capacity to actually do this type of work. And obviously there's growing pains when you're doing that. There was a time, I remember talking to a historian, structural engineer in Chicago, where the first poured in place concrete building in Chicago, everyone's like, you're crazy. And they left the formwork in for like an extra 40 days. And they had the crowd of 1,000 people come when they were going to take the formwork out, because everyone's like, this building's just going to collapse, right?
That's crazy. That's crazy to think.
But nowadays we're like, concrete. Oh yeah, it's like we've always done that. Yeah. But it's like, I think there's that just mindset, like anything when it's new, it's like, oh wow, why would I do that? I've already done this. But I think it's imperative people, I don't say it's necessarily timber. It's like, we need to think of more sustainable ways to build, and whether that's using concrete that doesn't require us to like emit huge amounts of pollution into the atmosphere. Like, they're looking at concrete using, I think it was like, it's, sort of the equivalent of like culture grown meat products or milk, right? We can't keep doing things that we've been doing with the kind of population growth and scale and expect that the planet is going to be okay. We need to think of different ways of building. And I think timber is one of those, right? It's not the silver bullet for it all, but it's like moving in a direction where we're thinking more about how we build connects to the health of the climate or the world as a whole.
And you guys have been developing the use of mass timber and doing these innovations for the last 10 or so, maybe probably more years than that. Have you seen a change in the construction industry and maybe even extending to the general public in terms of the acceptance? Like, are people warming up to it, and it's sort of turning the corner in terms of how much is being accepted?
Yeah, and I mean, the funniest thing is we're considered to be experts, and we started in mass timber in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that long ago. It's 8 years,
Yeah.
it's like whatever, 8 years ago, seven, and but it's just, I think it's phenomenal to see in that time period, how much has happened, how much has evolved. I think so much of like these things are driven by human experience, and I would say even the desire. I think that one of the reasons we've done, mass timber office buildings in Portland, or there's been a number of them built in Portland, is because we've run out of old wood warehouses that, to be office space or to even be loft space. Because people love those types of buildings. They like to be in them.
Mm.
And they're like, well, we don't have any left, so we'll have to build some new ones, right? I mean, at a very basic level.
Sure.
Yeah. And I think then there's the sort of, well, if you're going to be doing that, how do you do that sustainably? How does that work with the supply chain? So, and then how does that maybe connect to things like housing? But the original sort of structures that we built, like our office was a speculative project that a developer, was like, hey, he's very interested in sustainability and issues around sustainability, but there was also this clear demand for these types of spaces where people walk in and they feel good because it's like a beautiful wood structure.
Mm-hmm.
I think people have a true connection to timber that, like you said, it's like you can't really explain what it is, but I think maybe there's this sort of recognition that it was once alive, and and it's sort of something mysterious about that, right?
Yeah, getting back to the poetry of it.
I know.
So I was also curious about maybe more from a business perspective, because you guys do seem to spend a lot of time thinking about these things, problem solving them. Do you receive funding from, I don't know, whatever organizations to explore and experiment with these types of systems and materials, or how does that work? And I kind of ask because a lot of architecture offices, it's tough enough just to be an architecture office. Yeah, I mean, this, and then to go further, to spend time to dive into complex things that are not that extend beyond the architect's typical scope of sustainability, how things are sourced, and structures, as you mentioned, which is not just aesthetics. How does that work?
Yeah, I think we were very fortunate. We won the U.S. Tall Wood Building competition in 2015, and with that came a grant to do full-scale component testing to demonstrate that you could build tall buildings with timber. In that case, it was 12 stories, so it's not like it's a high rise, but it's not super tall.
Mm-hmm.
So 150 feet, and so as part of that, we were able to, that money, that $1.5 million was basically for that effort, for that additional testing. And so we managed that whole effort, and that was through a grant. That was the money was really not for the building. It was for that grant. And then that testing, which is now, it's publicly available, through Woodworks, and has been used on projects, beyond what we got involved with. Kind of was the start. But I would say that, with the De Young Museum, when I was at Herzog Dammram, and even the early work at Lever, it was very much about thinking about value and economy right from the start of the design. So, I kind of threw out the kind of note about picking out the panel, but our first project for Art House it was all about picking out what's the cheapest panel, cheapest metal panel that doesn't make us want to throw up, and starting with that as opposed to kind of imagining that we could afford more, Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's a little bit, I call it a little bit like you play the scales, very quickly on these types of projects. I mean, that housing project was like $150 a square foot, which you could never do today. But it still doesn't look that way. It was actually 147, but it doesn't look that way. But the way we knew we had this really tight budget, so we just immediately in the office we're like, okay, let's try to start with what's the least expensive material sort of in every piece of the project, and then kind of start the cooking from there.
Yeah. Right.
Because we're like, oh, this is kind of a cool chevron shaped panel. Mm-hmm. And we're like, well, what if we design the building with this idea of a chevron, and then had sort of daylight, each of those elements. So it's sort of this, you start at the concept level and you go all the way down to like, well, here's the panel level. And then you go back up and say, oh, well, if I got that, I know that will work. We know we can't pick anything less expensive than that. We'll take it all the way up to the concept. And so then we're kind of, instead of being more linear in the design process, we're kind of doing that, right? And so at a certain point, and ideally we're kind of doing that. So right at the beginning, we kind of have the whole thing somewhat baked from a cost kind of
interesting
concept idea. But I think I think that was super helpful early on. I think now we've had to be a little more open, because sometimes, we can be almost too practical, and people, maybe not everyone wants that.
Do you guys still apply for grants pretty often for the research
we
side?
have some grants. We have 2 grants. One is for this rocking wall, and then we actually have 3 grants that we're a part of. Like we were one of the. We were also like just involved, in projects. So we have a grant focused on sourcing forest, sort of trying to educate people and ourselves about sourcing and what that means for forest health. So we're working on that. And then we're also involved with the Neri Tallwood Rocking Wall with a couple of universities. We're the architects. Now there's 30 people involved, but initially there were 5 of us, and we were the architect of the group. I think they applied for the NSF grant, and I think the feedback they got is like, you guys need an architect on your team. So they said, okay, we'll help you out. But it was fun because we've been involved in that for now 7 years, since 2000, for a long time. And it's exciting to see. And, we've become friends with the researchers at the universities. And then we're currently engaged in another performance-based design effort for a new structural system. And that was because the client was really interested. So that's an unusual client. But I think the nice thing is since we've gone through it once, which with the framework project, we really know how to do it, which is pretty unusual. It's like we literally hire we hire the testing lab. We have a contract with them, and we just recently had a test last week. So and everyone gets really excited because it's like this. The structural engineers are designing these elements, and then we're just literally breaking them in a lab. With
that's pretty cool.
500 kips. 25 dump trucks of pressure on them or something.
That's fun.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
You guys have,
but it's really unusual. Nobody else. I was like, I don't know if any other architect. Maybe some. There's some SOM structurals doing some testing, but I mean, I just don't. It's usually, it's just, there's a few that maybe get to do this, and Europe maybe more, but it's just not, we feel really fortunate to be involved in that.
You guys have an office in LA now, and I'm kind of curious, like, what is LA is such a non, I don't know, like sensitive place to nature, or like, like the whole kind of like being responsible and maybe more sustainable in the way things are built.
Well, certainly compared to Portland.
Compared to Oregon and Portland and the rest of that coast. So I'm kind of curious, like, what drew you guys to open up a location in LA?
Well, part of it is I'm from California.
Yeah.
And we've always done work in LA, for the very beginning. I mean, I would say Lever's always been a Portland, LA office. We just haven't had an office there. Like, our first major office project was, for Walt Disney Company in Los Angeles, in 2012, big renovation project. And even, I think, and then I think there's an interest in LA in like just rational, functional, nicely done, material focused work. I think there are people that really are excited about that type of work, and I think it's part of a tradition, a strain of LA architecture that is very much about innovation and value. And I would say the Eames and folks like that really fit into that. I mean, they're heroes of mine. So I think that there's space for that in LA. There's also space for lots of other folks doing things that are maybe more formally experimental.
Yeah.
But I think when you look at Gary, and he had this formal kind of idea, and then he was like, well, I need to figure out exactly how this is going to happen. And he did, because nobody else was going to figure it out for him. And I think with the timber and some of the things we're doing, that's sort of the approach we've taken. It's like, to do something really well, to create value, sometimes you have to kind of dive into the details of the supply chain and really figuring it out for people. And eventually other people will come along and, take that and expand on it. But I think the thing, we also won, we won this, competition. I think it's like 5-6 years ago, and now it's finally coming out of the ground, for, NBC Universal and also, the Spring Street project in Chinatown, really fortunate to work with a developer who was like, hey, that they are interested in design and innovation, and, really trying to kind of capitalize on what makes LA such an amazing melting pot of architecture, ideas, and people, and climate. What we're doing in LA, we couldn't do in Portland. We have this building where all the circulation is outside and has plants, and that was pre-COVID, but it seems pretty well suited now that we've gone through COVID, to have a building that is super focused on outdoor space, outdoor workspace, and circulation that is possible in the kind of climate of Los Angeles.
Yeah, good weather.
That makes sense.
Final question for me is, what is your favorite building outside of the Schindler, in case that would have been your answer?
Oh, definitely Ronchamp.
Oh, great answer.
Good answer, yeah.
I'm assuming you've been there in person.
Yeah. I have. It's and the funny thing is, my wife and I were on our honeymoon in like 1997, and we're driving on the freeway through France, and I'm like, whoa, wait a second, I know that picture, let's get off here. That was like, we were driving right outside of, it's a little north of Switzerland, and we're just like, we got to go visit this. She's like, what? Okay. I'm like, yeah, okay. I didn't even know we were close by, and it was
That's
just
amazing.
Like, yeah, so that's such an amazing building.
That's a great
there's lots of other great buildings, but
it's a pretty unique one.
Yeah. It's amazing that you happen to be driving by it. It's like, it's pretty random.
Well, it's also funny because that actually, it happened. This is the same trip. We were like driving through Spain, and I'm like, oh, wait a second, we're near Bilbao. There's a new building here that's just finished. Frank Gehry just finished this building, and I'm like, she's like, well, where is it? I'm like, we'll see it.
You'll know.
So we just got off the freeway.
Yeah.
And like, you just like, it was not open yet. Wow. I remember going and seeing this. It's like a spaceship that landed in this grimy little town. It was, shouldn't say grimy, but it was pretty like Bilbao when it was this brilliant idea. It was pretty industrial city, tough, and they totally changed it.
Yeah. Awesome. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. I think we learned a lot about mass timber and also your life and everything else. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail. If you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion, feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.